Are you ready to build a gaming PC? Well, you have clicked on the right video. Hello and welcome to our 2021 gaming PC tutorial, proudly sponsored by our friends here at Micro Center. By the end of this video, you should have everything you need to know on not only picking out your components, but also how to put them together and build yourself that sweet new gaming rig. Shall we get started? The first place to start is with your processor. Now this is really the brain of the system, and it will impact a lot of your performance across the board. Now today we're going to be taking advantage of the Ryzen 5 5600X. Now of course this has been an incredibly popular processor, and therefore it is not the easiest to find, although of course we'll have links to all of the components we're using in the description of this video, but this is a great place to start. Now when it comes to building yourself a gaming PC, the gaming part is kind of important, and that is where a graphics card comes in. Now in this case we're going with a Gigabyte Aorus Master RTX 3070. This is a high-end card. It's not incredibly over the top like a 3090 or something would be, but this is a solid option, especially if you want to build something in that high but not extreme kind of price category, which is what this whole build is all about. Now the next part is a little bit more complicated, and it is your motherboard. So there are a bunch of things to keep in mind when choosing a motherboard, but the most basic version of it is this. A motherboard is essentially the motherboard that you connect all of your components to. First of all, you need to make sure that it is compatible with your CPU. So you see our little AMD Ryzen logo here. This means that it will work with our Ryzen 5 processor. But the other thing that you need to consider is the actual chipset and the features that are on board. So this is a B550 board, which means that it should fully support everything on our Ryzen 5 processor. So this is an ATX board. This is the standard size. You've got 7 slots. You can load up like graphics card, you can throw in like a network card, Wi-Fi, all kinds of stuff, including a capture card, right? This is probably what most people are going to want to go for, but for our purposes, the B550 Aorus Master is perfect. Next up, we have our memory, otherwise known as RAM. Now this is a little bit more simple. There are only 2 things you really need to pay attention to. Well, 3 if you care about the aesthetic and the RGB, but 2 as far as the actual functional difference. First of all, 16 gigs I think is a good sweet spot for a lot of gaming PC builds. So this one is clocked at 3600 megahertz, which is a good sweet spot for Ryzen, both 3rd and 5th generation. Obviously, you need to save a couple bucks, you can go a little bit lower than that, but that is the kit that we've opted for here. So today, we're going to be using probably the best SSD on the market for gamers right now, which is the Samsung 980 Pro. Not only is this going to give you incredibly fast load times, but it also is going to give you plenty of storage space as well. Now we've got all of our shiny new components, but the only thing we're missing here, besides a case, is something to power them with, which is where the aptly named power supply comes in. So this is a NZXT C750, which is what we're going to use for this system. When it comes to picking yourself a power supply, there are a few things to keep in mind. First of all is the wattage. Kind of self-explanatory, the whole purpose of the power supply is to power your components. Now they do actually come in a couple different sizes, so there are small form factor supplies. Those are usually only used for very small form factor builds. Most of the time you're going to use a standard size ATX. But if you take a look on the back of this box, you'll see a little 80+ gold badge. This is important. Now while yes, we could certainly get a cheaper 750 watt power supply, those are generally not 80+ rated, and you really want to look for that 80+ rating. Now comes the fun part, the case. Now this is really where you get to customize your system, right? So of course you can pick the actual level of performance of your components, but the case is the most visual part, right? So this is very much going to come down to what you want your gaming PC to look like. So this right here is a mid-tower ATX chassis. This is probably the most common sort of case you're going to find, and this will be able to fit all of our components and then some. We can add water cooling, we can do a lot of stuff inside this chassis. Now before we finish up, there's one more item that you may or may not need, which is a CPU cooler. Now to clarify, you need a CPU cooler. The difference is some processors actually come with pretty decent stock heat sinks in the box. We're going to go with the NZXT Kraken X53. Every case has different configurations for how big the radiator can be, how many fans it can support, what kind of locations, all that kind of stuff. This is a pretty safe bet. This should fit in most chassis, but before you pick up any kind of liquid cooling, make sure it fits in your case.
Before we continue, Micro Center has a very cool promotion going on right now where you can get yourself a free 32GB micro SD card as well as a free 32GB USB stick. And when I say free, I mean free. Of course, you have to pick it up in store, but other than that, check it out at the link in the description. And what could be better than something free? Other than, I don't know, maybe a free gaming PC tutorial on YouTube, perhaps?
Now comes the fun part. So before we actually get started, all you need to do is make sure you have a nice work area prepped. Get yourself a nice sized table, just a hard surface, and try not to build on carpet. For tools, you need exactly one thing, a Phillips screwdriver. Now I have my handy kit here, which is an electric screwdriver. I have a bunch of bits, but honestly, this is not completely necessary. If you have an electric screwdriver, it's a little bit faster, but generally speaking, as long as you have a Phillips screwdriver, that is the only tool we will need to build ourselves a gaming PC. So the first step is to start disassembling the case. You don't have to go completely crazy, and every case is slightly different. So for example, the H510 has a nice tempered glass window, but all we need to do is set that off to the side. And then if we want to flip around to the back side, we can also remove the couple of screws that are holding the back panel on. So with that, we have much easier access to the system. So this is the back of the system. So this is where we can install something like a hard drive or an SSD here. Now the nice thing about what NZXT have done with this is they actually have some nice cable channels, which we will be taking advantage of later. Fun fact, cable management, it's, look, there's two schools of thought. You can run it nice and neat, or you can jam it all in and no one will ever look on the back of your system. It's up to you. The next step, of course, is going to be installing our power supply. Now this is actually pretty straightforward because really all we're gonna do for right now is just put it inside the chassis and screw it in. All the actual cable management and stuff will be done after we're done putting everything else in. So you can see that there are differently labeled components for things such as CPU, PCIe, which would be for graphics card, peripherals, SATA, motherboard, etc. But just keep in mind that when you go for a modular supply, it just means that your cable management can be a lot cleaner. You don't have to spend all kinds of time tucking 85 extra cables you don't need in the back panel. You can just plug in what you need. One of the main cables we're going to always use is a 20+4 pin. So you can see that it's broken up into two parts. So this is the part that goes into the power supply. You can see it's broken up here. And then the end is this very long cable like this. Motherboard 20+4 is right here. So if I set it down, all I need to do is connect the little part on the left side. It should just clip right in. These all go in one way. If you can see the little clip, it'll only go in the one way. And then we'll connect to the other side here, push it in until we get a little click. There we go. This part, the PSU part, obviously goes into our power supply. And then we have two 6+2 pin connectors. This is what powers the graphics card. And then we'll just plug it in just like we did before. And that will be another cable ready to go. Next up, we have the CPU power connector. Now this will also go to the motherboard. I'll show you in just a little bit, but again, we want to make sure that this is going to be plugged in. For this, it's just as simple as finding the CPU tag on our power supply and plugging the PSU end into it. And that's one more. Now for our specific motherboard, we do actually need to plug in a second one of these CPU power connectors. And once we get the click, we're good to go. Now SATA is used for a few things. Traditionally, it was used for power supplies going to your hard drives, right? So you're using a standard old school hard drive or a SATA-based hard drive or SSD, you use this to power it. However, these days, mostly what this is used for is powering some of your RGB accessories, hubs, all that kind of stuff. And specifically for us, we're gonna be using it to power our AIO. With our cables attached to our power supply, now it is time to install it in the system. So for this system, we're gonna take that power supply, we're gonna face that fan upside down, facing toward the bottom of the system. We're gonna slide it into place. The most important thing is, we just wanna get this roughly in position. And if you look on the back side, you'll see that it should line up, something like that, and you'll see 4 screw holes. Take a closer look here. There should be one in pretty much each corner, right? So there's 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now it is time to grab the little baggie of screws that came with your power supply. Again, the ones that you're not supposed to lose, and start screwing it in. Now, when it comes to screwing kind of any hardware, and this actually goes for not just the power supply, but for some of the other things we're gonna do later, it pays to do it in a cross pattern. So don't just go sort of put everything in a circle. Instead, so we just started with that top left. Now we're gonna go to the bottom right so that we're evenly applying pressure. Now for this, you don't have to have it super, super tight. As long as the power supply is not moving, it shouldn't be a problem. So we can always come back through and tighten things later. But with that, we have our power supply installed and you have your first step to building a gaming PC complete. Look at that. All right, now let's get into building some of the more fun components. So for this, we're gonna wanna grab a few items. So first of all, we'll grab our memory, have that handy. Also grab yourself the M2 SSD. Of course, if you're using a standard SSD, you can install that later, but for M2, we'll go ahead and grab that right now. You'll also wanna grab your processor, so in this case, our Ryzen 5. And last but not least, we want our motherboard. Next step is to unwrap the motherboard. Now with this, like I said, it is a piece of electronics which is a little bit sensitive to static electricity. Try not to grab it from the actual PCB. So you'll see that there's a lot of like metal components here. It's not a big deal, but generally speaking, try to grab it by components that are a little bit more durable, ultimately up to you. But once you actually have it out, set it down on the box that it came in. So the first thing to start with is the CPU socket. Now that's pretty much always in the top middle of the board. Beside that, you're always going to have your RAM. Now right to the right of that, you'll see our 20 plus 4-pin power. Now that is that big connector that we connected to the motherboard. So we'll be using that a little bit later, but essentially that supplies power to the vast majority of your various components on the board. Now if you look on the top here, you'll have our CPU power connectors. Now again, every board is different. Sometimes you'll have 4, sometimes you'll have 8. This has 8 plus 4, so just keep that in mind. Not all power supplies have capacity to do, say, 12 pins of CPU power. You usually don't need that much, but it's on there, and if you have it, you should plug it in. Moving down the board, we also have ourselves a PCI slot, or in this case, we have several. Now this is usually where you'll plug in things like, well, first of all, your graphics card. So for the graphics card, you want to plug that into the top slot, which in this case is our shiny metal slot. Moving over to the right, we have USB 3.0. USB 3.0 is an annoying connector. I have broken this many times. Now to the right of that, we have our front panel connector. Now besides that, the only other thing we really need to take a look at is where we install our SSD. The only thing to keep in mind is exactly which screw you're going to use to mount the SSD. So if you take a closer look here, you actually have 3 options here. So you see 42, 80, and 110. 80 is by far the most common size of SSD, but if you ever have any kind of doubt, you can just sort of roughly measure it, and you see that that lines up pretty much perfectly. So you'll see that it's actually keyed on one side. So again, it will not go in the wrong way. And then you just line it up with the slot, slide it in until it goes all the way, and that's pretty much it. The last step here is there's a tiny, tiny little screw, which again is usually included with the motherboard. So this one was actually already screwed into place. All we need to do is use this to hold down the SSD. So I'll just line it up like this, screw it in, and that is it. Before we put the little cover that was covering up the SSD back in, if you flip it around, you'll actually see that it already has a thermal pad already applied. Now we'll go ahead and remove the plastic here. Now this is not 100% necessary for all SSDs, but essentially this will just help to serve as a heat sink so the SSD won't get too warm. So we'll just slide it in like this. And then we're gonna gently drop it right on top of that SSD. And then the screw in the back should line up and we can screw it right down into place. Before we install the CPU, there's just one thing we need to do. So if you come over to the socket, you'll see there's a little retention arm on the side. Pull that out and up. It's literally all you need to do and it will get it all prepped. Pretty much the same process for an Intel motherboard. Now we'll grab our CPU. Now with the CPU, be careful, especially with an AMD CPU, grab it from the side, which you can see the plastic's kind of already cut out there for you. So grab it from the side, and again, just do not touch those pins. Now when it actually comes time to install it, there's a little gold arrow on both the front as well as on the back. It's a little smaller on the front, and that is going to line up with the corresponding arrow on the socket, right? So in this case, it looks like we're putting it in sort of sideways, but this is the correct orientation. When it comes time to install it, it's not that bad. Just be nice, smooth, and careful. So just we'll rest it in very gently. It should just drop right into place. There we go. Don't push it, don't force it, nothing like that. Once it's resting nicely in place, you take that arm, you push it down. Sometimes it's a little bit firmer than others, but besides that, congratulations, you just installed yourself a CPU. Pat yourself on the back. Next up, let's install our memory. So in this case, we have 2 DIMMs of G.Skill Ripjaws. Now, this board actually supports 4, and that actually does matter. Less so, again, on Intel. Usually it's a little bit easier on that side, but for AMD, you actually want to put these into very specific slots. You'll see that about 2/3 of the way down, there's a little notch. This notch, again, surprise, surprise, means it goes in only one way. So if you come over to the board, you'll see that there's a little notch in each of the DIMM slots, right? Now, before we install it, you actually want to make sure that you're installing it into the correct slots. So again, for Intel, it doesn't make a massive difference. You just want to have it paired up in banks A or B. But for AMD, you want to specifically put it in the far right slot. So if you take a look, it actually says it on the board here. So you'll see that it has a little diagram here. So it's A1, A2, B1, B2 going from left to right. You actually want to populate A2 and B2 first, right? So instead of putting it in that first slot, I'm gonna put it in the second and the fourth slot. All you need to do is just take your memory, you line it up in the correct orientation. So again, making sure that notch is gonna clear. And then once it looks all fine, take your thumbs on each side and just firmly press until you hear clicks. There you go. Got the second module, line it up with our third slot, again, keeping in mind what the motherboard manufacturer recommends. And then again, we'll just line it up, make sure it works, and then boom. Okay, so with our system on its side, now it's time to drop the board in. Now, if you're using a motherboard that does not have the pre-installed I/O shield, this is the time where you would want to go ahead and snap that in the back. But because our system already has it, you can pretty simply drop it in. So if you take a look inside, you'll see that for this system, we already have all of our standoffs installed. So you see these little standoffs on the bottom, in the middle, as well as on the top. Now, because we have a chassis that already has these installed and we're using an ATX board, it drops right in. We don't have to do anything. Traditionally, a lot of systems at least will need you to install these yourself. Now, it will come inside a little box or bag of hardware that came with your system. So just keep an eye for that. So now we're just gonna gently drop it into place. So it should pretty much be lined up with the top of the chassis. So drop it in here. It's gonna be kind of hard to get on camera, but essentially we're gonna move the board forward until we see that middle slot. And there we go. It is installed. So once it's sitting on that peg, you should be able to see all of your screws through the standoff holes on the board. So one of the nice things about the way the NZXT label their screws is that they're well labeled. So there are a few different kinds of screws that are included with the system. This is what we're gonna look for specifically for the motherboard. You can tell really quickly if you have the wrong screw because it won't tap in right. So, you know. From here, it's pretty straightforward. You just want to take your screw, and in the same way we did it before, we're going to do a cross pattern. We're gonna start with the bottom left, just because that's the easiest to get at, and then we'll screw it into place, and then we'll grab our next screw and work all the way around. So for this board, there are, I believe, a total of 8 screws. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 screws that we need to attach. So I'll see you in a minute after I finish screwing all these in. Next up, we have our CPU cooling. Now this is the part of the tutorial that's actually going to vary the most based on your specific build. So if you're using an air cooler, you're gonna use an entirely different kind of instructions for it. Honestly, even if you're using the stock cooler that comes with it, it's gonna be pretty simple. Don't feel like you have to go out and do liquid cooling, but that's the main reason why I'm using this AIO is because they're incredibly popular. I wanna give you a little bit of an idea of how to install it. Thankfully, this is actually fairly easy to do on an AMD motherboard. So if you come over here, I've already removed, there's a little plastic piece on the top and on the bottom of the CPU. So go ahead and remove that, but I would only do the first one, right? Leave that other one there because there's a back plate on the back, and that way it won't fall, right? So with 2 of these removed, all I need to do is pull out, there's a little baggie that says AM4. You'll pull out the standoffs and you'll start screwing them into place. Now with this, you just wanna do it finger tight. You don't have to get it super, super cranked down or anything. And then once I have these 2 into place, I will then remove this top plastic component dude. Wow. We're deep in the tutorial, I'm calling things dudes. I've run out of words. Once we have these standoffs in place, we're ready to actually begin putting the AIO into place. Now, if you take a look at it, what we actually have here are a few different components. So we have, obviously, the fans. These are kind of important. We also have a baggie of the hardware. So we'll have some short screws, some long screws, and some washers. We'll use that in a minute. But the most important component here really is going to be the AIO and the pump as well. So this is the radiator. So what you can do is think about this as where we're gonna remove all of that heat, right? Now, for this, the first thing to learn is just how the airflow works, right? So if you look at the fan, this is the front, right? So air is coming in through this side. And if you flip it around, you'll see the actual frame of it as well as the cable. This is where air is coming out of. So we have 2 of our fans. Now, before we mount these, there are different ways to do it, but this actually makes it easy. So if you come take a look at this, I actually have a little plate that I can remove, right? So not all cases are gonna have this, but this is essentially a bracket. So the way we're going to do it is simple. So we're gonna start with our fan facing inward, then we're gonna have our plate, and then we're going to put our actual radiator on top. Now the only thing we need to do here before we get started is just pull out our hardware. So that is where we're gonna use these long screws, as well as you're gonna use washers. So once you just sort of slot that through, if I flip the entire thing over and make sure it's all aligned, it should just go straight in. Doesn't have to be super tight. Honestly, you may need to wiggle things around to make sure that the second fan fits, but that's on there. Now we'll take another screw, we'll take another washer, and again, we'll use the cross pattern to attach it on the bottom. Having a plate that removes like this makes this a lot simpler because some cases you'll kind of have to be like crouched in here and you're like trying to screw it from the top and from the side, and obviously you got this whole thing dangling from the bottom, so you want to be a little careful. So that is pretty much what it's going to look like. So we have our fan on that side, and then this is going to live something like that. So once you've confirmed this actually all fits, we can go ahead and take it back out and finish screwing the rest of it in and get these fans nice and tight. Now comes the fun part. Let's install the pump, and then the CPU is essentially going to be done. Couple things to learn here. First of all, there are different retention brackets that will hold it in, right? So we've removed all the plastic, so again, just don't touch that part. This is the one for AM4. It's labeled in the instructions. It's taller and narrower, so it's a little bit more of like a rectangular shape. And to put it on, you just line it up and rotate it, right? I think that should be fine. We can obviously try to get these bends to be a little bit cleaner. Keep in mind that every system's gonna be different. Sometimes this looks a little ugly, so don't be in a huge rush. Think about if there's a way to get it in there slightly smoother. Last thing to consider, there are a couple of different things that need to be plugged in. So you have the cables, they're included. But again, when you decide which orientation you want to put it in, just consider that you have two cables coming out one side. So, you know, try not to run it across half the system if you can. If there's a way to like rotate to the right and tuck it around, whatever. Once you're ready, grab yourself your screw, line it up, and we're gonna be good to go. It's 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I will just do them finger tight. Don't worry about getting it super tight at the moment. Again, very important, do a cross pattern. So I'm gonna keep pressure on the middle here, and I'm gonna line it out right here. But basically just sort of evenly apply pressure, and you actually wanna go all the way around a couple times to make sure that that thermal paste is spreading out nice and neatly. Now don't worry about our cables, we're gonna move that a little bit out of the way, but let me find my screwdriver, and what we'll do is we'll just tighten that up. Again, just go around a couple times, nice and slow, so you're evenly applying that pressure, and we're pretty much done. We're gonna have an AIO installed. Got that liquid action, my friends. So when it comes to cable management, one of the nice things about this NZXT case is they've actually done a lot of the work for you. So you see you actually have cable channels here as well as the little like Velcro ties to hold them down. And so once you start running things, it's actually pretty straightforward. So I always like to start with that 20+ 4-pin motherboard power connector. Now you'll see here that what we've got is we actually have a channel which is pretty much perfectly labeled, although I will get that part out of the way. So all we need to do is just drop this right in here. We'll rotate it up here, and we can even go ahead and Velcro it down just for the moment. And then once it comes out here, we just need to pull it through to the front of the case. So don't worry about getting things too neat, but if I turn it around, you'll see that now it has come out pretty much in the perfect spot. So again, there's a little notch here, so it's only gonna go in one way. I'll rotate it around, and there we go. Just press it in, and boom. Connected, and importantly, it's nice and clean. You can hardly see it at all from the front. Next, let's install our CPU power. So again, there's another cable channel back here. So we'll deal with the excess there in a little bit. So we have ourselves our CPU number 1, and we have our CPU number 2. So if you look all the way up here on the top left of the board, like I was showing you earlier, there's our 8-pin as well as our 4-pin for the power. So these have already been run out here. So I'll just drop my light down here and just plug it in. Again, it's 4-pin, so it's only gonna go in one way. Now, the only problem is that fan's in my way, isn't it? Hey. Well, this is gonna be tight. Apologies, it's kind of hard to show on camera, but essentially you can see that we've got everything plugged in here. So now we'll come around back and start grabbing some of our cables from the case. So I've gone over some of these on the board. So this one is our HD audio, self-explanatory, it goes into that audio jack. We have this little guy, which is USB-C. Now, not all cases have this and not all motherboards have this. So in fact, our motherboard does not support USB-C, but you plug that in here. This is that USB 3.0 I was telling you about. This connector is terrible, but it will do the job as long as you're careful. And then one of the nice things about NZXT is they have your front panels all on one little block. First up, I have my audio. So just like all of these things, I feel like I'm a broken record here. You'll see that it is 9 pins with 1 knocked out, which means it's only gonna go in one way. And I'm gonna rotate around and plug it into my audio port right here on the bottom left of the motherboard. So now I'm gonna route my USB 3, and that one does have the notch, so it goes in the one way. So we'll just rotate it around and slide it right into place. Just be firm with it, push it in, make sure it's all the way seated, and try never to touch it again. Now we have the fun part, which is our front panel little header. This is gonna be far simpler than usual because I literally have to just line it up and plug it directly in. Now they did give you that little cheater in case your board is different, but I think this all should line out. And if I plug it in like this, hopefully that'll be everything. Coming back to the cables that came with our all-in-one liquid cooler, you'll see that this is the part that goes into the actual cooler. So that'll be mounted right here on the side. And then it has all kinds of fun goodies to plug into. So we have a pump header. So this will go to the motherboard. You'll see it's 3 pins with a notch on either side. You'll also see we have this little guy, as well as we have our SATA power. Grabbing my splitter that came with the AIO, I'm gonna take my 4-pin fan header. You can see right here, it's got the 2 little notches. I'm gonna plug that into my CPU fan. Now that is gonna go right on the top. And then I'm gonna route the rest of that cable through the back, and we'll deal with that in just a second. And then I'm also going to, at the same time, run the cable for the pump. So with the little 10-pin connector that came with our AIO, we're gonna now plug that into the side. It should just clip right in. And then with that, we have a bunch of these cables which we can route around, but this little 3-pin, that is gonna go into our CPU optional connector, which is right up here. So now we have both of them connected. We just need to route these 2 extra cables through to the back of the system. And I'm gonna use that same little hole in the top of the chassis to make it as neat as possible. Now we're gonna plug that micro USB cable that we also got with the AIO in. Just gonna plug in one way, and then I'm gonna pull the slack through on the back. Now, we have a couple of things to connect back here before we move on. So, first of all, we have the fans. So we have our 2 fan headers, or fan cables that came from the 2 fans in the front. We wanna connect these to that little extension that we ran earlier, right? So it should be pretty straightforward, so we'll just plug it in. They're notched, so yet again, there's only one way to plug them in, so that's 1. And this is 2, boom, easy enough. Now, beyond that, we also have one more cable we need to look for, which is that SATA power. So this is what's gonna power the pump, and that can plug into the SATA power from our power supply. So again, very simple. We'll deal with cable management in a minute. We just wanna make sure it actually posts first. So, plug that in. Again, because it is notched, it goes in exactly one way. And we are getting a lot closer. Next, let's take the USB 2.0 header from that micro USB cable we just plugged in to the side of the pump. We're gonna run that down. I'm just gonna run it through this cable channel here. Again, we'll kind of clean things up later once we know that it all works. And now we'll route it back out in the front. Pull it out here and plug it right into the motherboard USB 2.0 header. That way you can easily change stuff like the RGB lighting and whatnot on the system. So we have the 2 fans that came in the case that we now need to plug into the motherboard. So I've reached around to the back. Now this is gonna vary based on where the fan headers are on your motherboard. So I've routed mine over to the side here, and we're gonna plug that right into the system fan header on the right side. So that will be 1, and then I will grab the second one, which has also already been run, and that can run right beside it. That, my friends, is almost a fully completed gaming PC. There may be one thing missing though, the graphics card, which we've saved the best for last, because trust me, this is not the hard part. So this is our RTX 3070. Now, it's a fairly straightforward kind of installation. Just a couple things to keep in mind. Obviously, we have our fans, pretty straightforward. Down here on the bottom is our PCI slot. So this is the actual connector that goes inside the PCI slot on the motherboard, right? So it slides right in. On the back, these are all of our various display outs. They usually have these little plastic protectors. We're gonna just get rid of all of these. This is where you find your HDMIs, your display ports. Older graphics cards will have like DVI and whatnot. But this is what is going to go out the back of the case. Now, this is something that is gonna vary based on what case you're using, but you can see that we need to install it right here. Now, sometimes you can just remove the little screws holding the PCI cover. For this though, we actually have 2 little like screws holding a plate in. Take off this little plate, and then we get easy access to the screws. The only thing to do here is just make sure you're actually taking out the right screws, which is not as easy as it might seem, because before, you always just put it in the top slot. If you actually look inside this case, our PCI slot's actually on the second, right? So if I line it up just to make sure, we should see something like this, which would, yes, mean that we need to take the second and the third PCI cover out. Now, it is as simple as grabbing your graphics card, lining it up with where it needs to go on the motherboard, just keeping in mind that you do need to go directly into that top slot, or the topmost 16X slot. So we'll line it up there, and then just press it until it clicks. There we go. Now, because this is a heavy graphics card, I would recommend keeping a hand on it while you screw it into place, because otherwise it's not gonna wanna stay. So now I'm gonna run our two 6+2 PCIe power cables from the power supply and simply plug them into the card. Usually they're gonna be on this sort of leading edge. Sometimes they'll be on the back, but it just depends on the card. And with that, we just kind of pinch them together. So if you're using 8 pins like this, just make sure it kind of snaps. Otherwise it will not wanna, well, it'll fight you. It'll fight you on the way in. And now, we have built ourselves a gaming PC. There might be some cables that need to be cleaned and whatnot. But at this point, we're actually ready to make sure the power supply is flipped on, plug everything in, and see if it actually works. And if it doesn't, start troubleshooting. The moment of truth is here. So we've plugged in HDMI to our graphics card, we've plugged in our power supply, made sure it's on, and plugged in a mouse and keyboard. Now, let's press the power button and hope it works. Hey, all right, so we have 1, 2 fans spinning. We have the fans on the AIO spinning. The graphics card is graphics carding with our little display. We have our AIO on. We're running through codes. And then if we give it a few seconds, we should see something pop up on the display. So we have our Ryzen 5 5600X. I will say one of our memory modules is not showing up, so I'll just try to reseat that in a second. We have our 980 Pro SSD, and we have our 4 fans, even though it shows up as 3 because we have it all connected. All right, so with that, I'm gonna make sure that RAM module is properly seated, and we have successfully built ourselves a gaming PC. From here, go ahead and turn it off, do a little bit of cable management, tie some things up in the back, get Windows installing, and you've successfully built yourself a gaming PC. So thank you very much for watching. Please, if you found this tutorial helpful, subscribe to the channel because we do a lot of PC builds like this. And again, if you want to check out any of the components that we use for this build, the links will be in the description from our wonderful sponsor, Micro Center, who graciously allow me to crash their spot all day long as I showed you how to build a computer. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. We'll see you next time.